Muy buenas tardes. Me encanta estar aquí en Madrid para celebrar su excelencia con todos ustedes. Lo que me ha sorprendido un poco es que se me pidiera hablar en inglés, ni siquiera en francés. Será probablemente que el inglés sea la lengua del sistema monetario internacional, ¿no? Y que como en Roma se hablaba latín, cuando se trata de sistemas hay que hablar inglés. Bueno, pues empezaré muy rápido con la historia la más reciente. Y esta nos dice que, well, I must start in English now. If we look back to the economic history of the 40 to 50 last years, not to go further in the past, one fact will appear as the elephant here, the extremely disruptive role of the endless litany of monetary and financial crises. Overall, in the 40 years from 1970, there were 147 crises across the world, and you know that there are more or less 200 countries in the world. It means that 3 on 4 countries had this experience of a financial crisis, and several of these countries had that several times. Well, the vast majority of the countries associated with crises were emerging market countries. However, more recently, many have occurred in the advanced economies, and I have the impression that here in Spain you had some experience of that. In the last few years, since 2007, there were 17 banking crises and 12 in advanced economies. How not to recognize then that there is something fundamentally wrong in the global economy and in the financial system? Of course, one can find explanatory reasons of this phenomena in the financial globalization. And globalization has been for years and years the scapegoat of all our problems. Well, and of course, it's true that the trade, technology, supply chains, globalization of finances have tied the countries together across the globe as never before. We are much closer now, the one from the others, than never before. And these developments have brought enormous benefits to the mankind. At the same time, those great benefits have been accompanied by heightened risks and have linked the global financial world in a manner that transmits crises at a pace previously inconceivable. We are all now affected daily by events which we have little or no control at all the more so as since the collapse of the so-called Bretton Woods system long ago. At the beginning of the 70s, we live, as far as the finance and monetary realities are concerned, in a non-system. We are still talking about the international monetary system, but there is not such a thing now as a financial system. Now, and we are in the aftermath of the most severe crisis of the last decades, if we don't want to see it again, we must face the need of a fundamental reform of this known system, a task we have been unable to fulfill during the last 40 years. Alas, the present circumstances don't seem to be more conducive to an agreement on that than they were before. But the need is obvious. The origin of this crisis, which has created so many problems, so many suffering, so many disasters in Europe and in the world, can be traced to the lack of discipline of precisely this non-system, leading to what Greenspan called the irrational exuberance, and of course, all the disorders in the global liquidity. Disorders, and of course, with them, the entire economy being put in a serious disruptive situation. To my judgment, the root causes of these disorders have not been really tackled by the G20 during the last 6 years. You know that the G20 has done a good job, and we have heard about their frequent meetings and the huge programs of the reforms of banking, of financial system, and so on they have been working on, but never going really to the roots of the problems. This leaves us with the risk of seeing the same causes creating the same effects. This is not acceptable, all the more as at the same time the financial world is quickly evolving toward a multipolar structure, calling for an in-depth effort to establish the basic principles of international cooperation and governance. There are overabundant reasons to call for a major reform to mobilize all the countries of the world, and mainly the most important ones, to a new conference which could, let's say, repeat the work which was done in 1955 by the Bretton Woods Conference. When I was at the IMF, I have resisted with very strong commitment the idea of a conference, of a new Bretton Woods Conference. Why? Because at that time, to talk about it was a reason not to talk about more urgent issues. But today, I feel legitimate in saying now it's the time to go to the roots of the problem and to call for a new Bretton Woods Conference. Should we then, but I was telling you earlier that the circumstances are very bad, that possibly the legislators around the world, mainly in the Congress of the United States, are not at all ready to legislate in this very complex system. Yes, but should we then wait for better times? I don't think so, because to abstain would expose us to the risk of being reminded of the need of that reform in the context of a new crisis, possibly worse than the one we have just suffered. So, how to transform these adverse conditions into an opportunity? I believe that the wise attitude would be for the government, and I'm proud to mention that in the presence of a member of your government. I believe that the governments should be who could be mindful of these risks should demonstrate their commitment to the purpose of a reform by starting identifying and possibly assembling the first building blocks of such a reform, and so creating the momentum for a new conference to be called, of course, having worked in advance to have a broad consensus prepared on the key tenets of a new agreement. Long time will be needed for such kind of an agreement. This means that it is time to start right now. But what should be, let's say, the first element of such a reform? The important thing is to mention that at least we don't start from a tabula rasa. And to give you an idea of the key ideas which are there in the minds of at least those who have been confronted with these problems in the past, I could sum up for you the proposals which were made at the heart of the recent crisis in 2011 by a group of 18 veterans of the monetary debates of the end of the last century, a group in which your country was admirably represented by Guillermo de la Dehesa, a group Paul Volcker, who was one of its key members, called the Palais Royal Initiative, referring to the place where we used to meet. What were the main proposals of that group, where you had such really an impressive group of leaders indeed? What were the key proposals? I would mention two, and while saying immediately that the group was not able to cover all the issues to be addressed, but at least it suggested two things which could be made promptly and quickly be in place. One, strengthening the surveillance of the International Monetary Fund. If to continue justifying its role as the central institution of the system in the context of a full renovation of this one, the IMF should be given real teeth and enjoy an image of unquestionable fairness in discharging its responsibilities. Fairness and effectiveness imply that this enhanced surveillance applies not only to exchange rate policies, but also to the evolution of global liquidity, to all economic and financial policies relevant for domestic and global macro-financial stability, and with particular tightness, and I insist on that, when applying to systemic countries from which major spillover effects on other countries can be expected. These last aspects would entail nothing less than a reverse approach to the one which prevailed for too long so far, when the surveillance was all the more tight when countries borrowed IMF money. Country under IMF program had to comply with the IMF recommendations, and they continue in general, not all. But if there is no money at stake, countries listen politely what the IMF says and possibly do something slightly different. This has to be changed, and the severity of the surveillance now should be concentrated on the countries with the most important systemic influence. All of that requires also, and I insist on it because several countries remain to be convinced, the broadening of the IMF mandate to the financial sphere. As we live now in the world where financial developments overwhelm the mere monetary and current exchange developments. Second set of important ideas from this group of veterans of the last battles of the last century, reforming the governance of the system. As enormous responsibilities are put in the shoulders of the IMF, the governance reforms should be pursued with a particular concern to make sure that all countries feel really at home in the new institutions, renovated enough, no more to be suspected to reflect mainly Western interests. For that, a few key measures appear indispensable. First, to implement promptly and to pursue as needed the changes in the distribution of the capital, the so-called quota of the IMF, and the distribution of the chairs in its executive board. Already, a part of the job has already been done by a Seoul summit in 2010, but so far the Congress of the United States has not worked in its ratification, and this is there in the air. I hope that the pressure of other countries on our US friends should help at least to have that done. Second reform, which would be necessary, would be to establish a new kind of governing body in the IMF, associating more the political responsibles in our countries, namely the ministers and the governors of the central banks, more explicitly on the responsibility of the institution for the most strategic decisions. We should also change the modalities of elections of management, abandoning the anachronic system according to which the US appoint the leader of the World Bank and the Europeans the leader of the IMF. I speak from experience. And then, more important indeed, even if this has not been seen immediately as something revolutionary, to lower the voting threshold on important decisions from 85 to 75%, and something possibly don't tell you anything to you, for you. But as for the important decision you need in the IMF, 85% of majority, this rule of 85, this rule allowed countries with more than 50% of quotas of capital, namely the US and the Europeans, when they vote together, to have a veto right. Well, this group has proposed to reduce this threshold to 75%, and then silently leading the Americans and the Europeans to abandon their veto power and then to have a more democratic institution. It remains to be seen if this would be ratified, but the most very important representative of Europe and of the United States have agreed on that. And then there is a decision to be taken, nobody mentioned, which is the need for providing the G20 with more legitimacy. The G20 is a self-appointed supreme governance body of the world. But there are 20. Of course, this arithmetic is always wrong, and there are, let's say, 30 countries, more or less, as the European Union is there. But there are only 30. And you have almost 200 countries in the world. If you want to have a body with legitimacy to adopt regulations applicable in the entire world, you need to change that. And to give to the G20 a new system of designation of its members, allowing each country of the world, even if you have only 20 to 25% there, represented through systems of regional constituencies. These are the measures which could be taken with no major difficulties, and the Palais Royal initiative was very emphatic on that. But a problem, and it is certainly the most difficult one to address, was couldn't be addressed in the framework of the Palais Royal initiative, is the old problem of the so-called Triffin dilemma, a problem already in the which was at the heart of the debates of the 70s, when General de Gaulle, for instance, was talking about the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. This privilege, which was simply resulting from the fact that the Americans could solve their own problem of balance of payment by printing their own money, and by doing that, providing the world with liquidity. Of course, from time to time, there was a kind of providential equilibrium between the needs of the balance of payment of the US and the needs of liquidity in the world. But this, of course, was a kind of miracle. In reality, many of the problems of our economies are the result of the fact that there is nothing in the system, no authority to regulate and to the provision of liquidity and to make it compatible with the and to put it in harmony with the need of the world system. Of course, lot of discussions have been started after our meetings in the Palais Royal, but de facto nothing has been effectively produced. And this is indeed where lies the most important problem to be solved now. One of the first things which are certainly necessary is to obtain from the central banks and the authorities in charge of macroprudential policies in the major countries to conduct their policies taking into account the need for appropriate global liquidity conditions. But the fact is that they have never done that. And there is still a lot of conviction power to be spent in order to bring them to this kind of better consciousness of what are the needs of the global economy. Well, then, of course, several attempts have been made to make sure that when there is a lack of liquidity, liquidity could be created, to make sure that there is excess liquidity, this liquidity could be withdrawn, and this task was in the 70s already, there were thought about giving this power to the IMF, and for that, a monetary instrument was created, the special drawing right, el derecho especial de giro, which could be utilized by the IMF to either inject liquidity or withdraw it. But this was created, the SDR was created for that. It was in reality almost never utilized in a sizable dimension for doing that, except during the last crisis when, in a kind of desperate gesture, in 2009, seeing that the liquidity of the world was totally dry, the IMF was asked to create and to inject $220 billion of liquidity. Let's imagine that this is done, then we would be realizing what was in the 1930s the dream of Keynes, who was saying at that time, the ideal system would surely be in the foundation of a supranational global bank that would have with the national central banks similar relations to those that exist between each central bank and the banks of its countries. Well, this suggestion could be seen as a utopia, but I must observe that all those who are confronted with the problem and who had responsibilities with that problem in the past, and I think in particular about my successor in the IMF, the former president of Germany, Horst Köhler, all come to the same conclusion. And recently, my friend Horst Köhler was saying in Oxford, I cannot help but notice that Keynes' ideas are gaining traction in economic policy. So how about also taking again these ideas of Keynes, namely to issue a genuine international reserve currency? The central bank governor of China also came to the same conclusion and made very precise conclusions, suggestions to this effect. I see that time I will run short of time. I must conclude promptly, but I believe that in a way or another, we will have to go in that direction. And in view of our responsibilities, we, the Europeans, as the third, as the most important trading power of the world, we will certainly have to see how we could start the negotiations to this effect. And, frequently I ask myself how the Europeans could do something sufficiently strong to call the attention and to really invite the rest of the world to work on that issue. And I hope not to give you headaches, Mr. Chancellor, Mr. Minister. I would suggest, for instance, that it would be time should come for merging the European quota chairs of the European system. Take them all together, and then you will have in the IMF a chair as important or slightly more than the one of the United States. And of course, it's difficult to decide that, and so something should be done before. And then I would suggest that two countries of the Euro group, for instance, Germany and France, I must put my country in the picture for that, should merge their chairs and invite the other countries to join. And then, after some reflection and possibly some disputes, the things could be done. And then a momentum for a more ambitious reform to be created. I would like now to conclude, only insisting on the urgency of revisiting carefully and with determination to act such issue. And because within 10 years, we will live in a very different world where the renminbi from China will have a weight comparable, if not higher, than the one of the dollar. We will no more be in a uni-central system, but we will be in a multi-center system. And then this system will have to be governed with regulations acceptable for all. So it's important to start now to work on that, because this negotiation, you know that pretty well, Mr. Chancellor, take a lot of time. They will take also something else I read here in these panels. They will take confidence and collaboration. I hope the leaders of the world will hear the message of this conference. Thank you very much.